of the Sonoma State University History Department. She received her BA in History from Georgetown University and her MA and Ph.D. from University of California at Santa Barbara. And in addition to her work as a historian, she has extensive experience as an archivist and manuscript curator at both Georgetown and University of California. And of course, her scholarly and research interests include Irish history. So this is, as far as I know, the first time we're ever having a lecture on this topic in this lecture series. So please help me welcome Dr. Noonan to the Holocaust and Genocide lecture series, where she's going to talk about the Great Hunger.
If you could just give me a minute. I think this is working now, but I should have gotten the memo that said I needed a pocket. So I'm just going to try to clip this on my belt here. Does anyone know any jokes? Yeah. Okay, we're ready. And I'm also going to ask you, I got up here this afternoon. I'm on sabbatical, so there might be a little bit of detachment in my connection to some of these more complex tech issues. But I got up here this afternoon and I realized that my computer was only 23% charged. And so we've had to make a decision. It's now at 50%. But if you see something flashing up there that says you have 3 minutes to to recharge your computer, let me know. So I've entitled my talk today, The Irish Need to Know Their Place. Famine and the Politics of Food, Ireland, Famine and the Politics of Food, from Charles Trevelyan to Priti Patel. I hope you won't feel like I got you here under false pretenses, because that part about Charles Trevelyan and Priti Patel wouldn't fit on the advertisement. So in 1965, the English historian A.J.P. Taylor drew the comparison between the Irish famine and the Holocaust, remarking, in the 1840s, all Ireland was a Belsen. In 1953, at a demonstration in New York City that attracted 10,000 marchers, marking the 20th anniversary of the Ukrainian famine, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide and authored the United Nations Convention Against Genocide in 1948, thereby providing us with the definition of genocide we still use today, noted that famine was an old method of genocide when Stalin used it in Ukraine. As Lemkin, I went to Catholic school, so if it goes out, I will just project and radiate, okay? It'll be fine. Lemkin reminded the marchers that famine was an old method of genocide when Stalin used it in Ukraine. As Lemkin reminded his audience, the high crime of genocide by starvation had been used by the British against the Irish 100 years before Stalin used it in Ukraine. This may seem a startling charge, one that might be expected to have lost its resonance had it not been for Brexit. That inexplicable, self-inflicted wound that English women and men seem determined to wreck the United Kingdom on, bringing both hell and high water to the Isles. The 2.5 years between the vote to leave the European and last month's whisper of an exit, you may have missed it, it did happen on January 31st, have revealed both the longevity of anti-Irish feeling among the English, now expressed in the rise of English nationalism, and the utter cluelessness of many Britons about Ireland, whether the North, which is, after all, a part of the United Kingdom, or the Republic, also known colloquially as Southern Ireland. Just now, I want to relate two stories. But first, there we go. But first, let's take the Brexit Map of Europe. And so, here's my thing. It's a little dim, but so this line, of course, is going here between the Republic of Ireland, which is kind of the light, and the north, which is red, and then Scotland, Wales, and England. Okay, so they kind of have this little dipper that is going to save Great Britain for the Great Britons. So I want to relate to you two brief stories. In the first, it was reported by Nicholas Watt in The Guardian, which is a major newspaper in London, and let us not forget Manchester, where it started. A Conservative member of the House of Commons, which the Conservative Party is the party that's been in power for the last 10 years, argued that the Irish needed to stop with their insistence that there be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I'll get the hang of this. Okay. There we go. Okay. Many have feared that the reimposition of a hard border would destroy 20 years of peace. That was brought about by the Good Friday Accords in 1998. The Tory politician, who, by the way, is not this person, claimed on the floor of the House of Commons, "This really cannot stand," and by that he meant the insistence on the part of the Irish that there be no hard border between the Republic and the North. "This really cannot stand. The Irish need to know their place. It is not right for a country of 4 million people to dictate terms to a country of 66 million. In editorials in the United States and Ireland, this Tory conservative politician was reminded that the Republic of Ireland, as part of the EU, is not a country of 4 million people, but an entity of 400 million people, the European Union. Brexit, of course, threatens to sink the British state. My students have been reading about this probably ad nauseum for about 2 years, always waiting for the shoe to drop, but I promise you it is coming. It has already sunk 2 prime ministers, Theresa May and earlier than that, David Cameron, and it has made Boris Johnson prime minister. Now, if you're not really sure why that is so startling to people, fans among you may recall that in 2012, Boris Johnson appeared on the David Letterman show, in which, in answer to the question about whether he thought he might become prime minister one day, Boris Johnson said he had about the same chance of becoming prime minister as he had of being reincarnated as an olive. Then last July, Priti Patel, that is her name, now Boris Johnson's Home Secretary, she is also a senior member of his cabinet. She also expressed frustration with Ireland and its intransigence, along with the EU, over the issue of the border. She suggested threatening Ireland with food shortages to force the Irish to give up their demands about the border. Now, the United Kingdom is the Republic's #1 trading partner, and a lot of food, strangely enough, even potatoes, come from the United Kingdom to the Republic of Ireland, which seems almost impossible, right, given today's lecture topic. And in fact, most crucially, the kind of potato that is used for chips in fish and chips comes from the UK and is not grown in the Republic. I can talk to you later about the varieties of potatoes and their qualities of holding oil and what makes a good chip and what doesn't. Anyway, Priti Patel said that perhaps the UK should use the threat of food shortages as a bargaining chip, and she asked, why has this point not been pressed home during negotiations? There is still time to go back to Brussels and get a better deal. As editorial pages throughout Ireland and London have noted, to threaten the Irish with food shortages when the famine is the touchstone of their history signifies an utter lack of historical knowledge, as well as treating the Irish as if they were a colony rather than a sovereign state. The level of ignorance and insensitivity exhibited by Patel was captured by the Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. Taoiseach just means prime minister. It's the leader of the state. Prime Minister Leo Varadkar responded to Patel's statement as he came out of a cabinet meeting in Donegal, Ireland. He said, "Where I stand now in Donegal," which, by the way, is in the west of Ireland, but the northern section, part of the Republic, "the population still has not recovered from the famine that was imposed upon us." It's kind of an odd twist, but in this little exchange, you actually have the granddaughter of Indian immigrants to the UK trading barbs with the son of a doctor from Mumbai. However, it seems to me that only one of these two politicians knows any history. So a few things to remember. Ireland, while ruled by England, and I'm using that term at this point because Ireland was first ruled by England in the 12th century. Okay. It's kind of a moving target, whether you say England or Great Britain or the United Kingdom, but it would be appropriate in the 12th century to say England. I'm not trying to flatter President Trump, who I know has expressed disquiet about the fact that nobody calls England England anymore. So in the 12th century, it was appropriate to call it England. Ireland had been autonomous, and we might even say that it was lightly ruled by the English from the 12th century until the end of the 16th century. The 9 Years' War, which started in the 1590s, ushered in more direct rule. When Hugh O'Neill, who as a young man had been raised at the court of Elizabeth I, when he revolted, it made the English question whether the Irish could be anglicized ever. Was there going to be any way to rule Ireland peacefully? Edmund Spencer, and I might, because actually at Georgetown I was also an English major, so I might ask for a hand of English majors, but I won't. That's okay. The English majors among you might recognize Edmund Spencer as the author of The Faerie Queene. He was also involved in the administration of Ireland. And after the 9 Years' War in the 1590s, he warned that while a solution to better government of Ireland should be found, if one could not be found, extermination might be the only answer. And I'm going to pause for a moment and ask you to remember his use of that term, extermination. It'll come up again. In 1801, Ireland was incorporated into a new entity, the United Kingdom. It was constitutionally joined to Scotland, Wales, and England by the Act of Union. Although the Irish lost their separate parliament in Dublin, they gained over 100 representatives in Westminster. So it's important to remember that when the famine struck, Ireland was not a colony or a protectorate. It was, in fact, a fully co-equal part of the United Kingdom. So let's consider the toll that the Irish famine, and we date the Irish famine from 1845 to about 1851. Some sources will include 1852, but it's really about that 6-year period. See, I promised I'd get better at this. Here we have a little map that shows population density. And in 1845, well, actually 1841, when the census had been taken, there were 8 million people. Does anybody know what the population of Ireland today is? Well, the population of the Republic is 4 million, and the population of Northern Ireland is about 1.8, so just under 6 million people. And this is more than 150 years on. So between 1845 and 1851, 1 to 1.5 million people died of starvation, of death, starvation, of disease. Okay. An additional 1.5 million to 2 million people between 1845 and 1851 emigrated to the United States, to the rest of the United Kingdom, and to Australia mostly. I want to show you this graphic. Did it advance? Okay. So you may not notice at first, but we are seeing, I can't step over there, that's right. We are seeing the date change below, right? So it's going to go all the way from 1841 to 2002. I'm going to ask you, when it gets to 2002, to now look at it and see what areas seem to be emptying out and what seems to be the really low point of population. So now that I've set the questions, I'll let you look at it again. Okay, it's just going to keep cycling. So what do you notice about that map? Yeah.
It seems to me that in 1961, it was a low point in the population.
Right. 61 or 71, that's right. So it's not 1851, the end of the famine. But in fact, it's more than 100 years later when we see the population at its lowest. How about the distribution of people? Did anybody notice anything about that? Yeah. I'm sorry?
They're all on the East Coast and Northern, I guess.
Yeah, they're centering around cities, Dublin, Belfast, Cork, okay? By 1990, we're actually beginning to see like real density around places like Galway. One of the things I'd like to point out, though, is that if you look in the top third of the country, over that period of time, there's a whole middle band that really pretty much disappears. And I will tell you, my sister and I went to Ireland in 1977, and we were there for like 4 weeks, driving around everywhere. And I remember saying to her, does anybody actually live here? We would drive for hours and hours, and in hours and hours, you can be from the top of Ireland to the bottom. But it was astonishing to us that there were so few people out in the countryside. So, why does this happen? What happened was the famine, because of death, disease, and emigration, set into motion patterns that meant that the population of Ireland did not recover even till today. Those Emigration patterns, what we call chain migration, right? One member of the family goes over, sends remittances back, eventually brings more and more members of the family over, has meant that it's only in recent times that the Irish have been able to stay in Ireland. Okay? For example, even in the 1980s, the fastest growing illegal alien population in the United States was Irish. Two of those people who came actually were Saoirse Ronan's parents. There's actually quite a number of pretty famous Irish people whose parents came to America in the late 1980s and thought that they were actually going to make a go of it, even though they were undocumented and wound up going back. One of the reasons you see such a dramatic and prolonged difference in these census maps is because the Irish famine had very long-term demographic effects and caused deep social change. Just to give you a few examples. One had to do with marriage. Okay? So the Irish tended, before the famine, to marry pretty much when other Northern Europeans married. They were pretty young, late teens, early 20s. Okay, we're not talking Romeo and Juliet here, but late teens, early 20s. After the famine, the age at marriage increases, and the span of years between husband and wife increases dramatically, so that husbands are considerably older than their wives. That was something that was not characteristic of Irish marriage beforehand. Another thing that we see is a much greater influence of the Catholic Church. I think you might be surprised to hear that the Irish were not particularly Catholic before the famine. Some people talked about them being only lightly Christianized. Yes, the parish was a center of life, but a lot of the folk beliefs when it came to religion certainly persisted. The trauma of the famine, and the Irish wondered what they had done to bring down this divine retribution to them, caused a devotional revolution in Ireland, so that, in fact, many people became much more observant, and the church came to play a much larger role, both socially and politically. It probably reached its high point in the 1937 Constitution, okay, in which the Catholic Church is said to have a particular role in the Irish state. Okay. Ireland has freedom of religion. You can be an atheist in Ireland. You could, under that constitution. But the Catholic Church was recognized as having a special place in the Irish state. Another thing that we see is that there is a tremendous decline in the speaking of Irish in Ireland. We think that about 50% of Irish speakers disappeared, died, or emigrated, which in some ways is not surprising because the vast majority of Irish speakers were in the west of Ireland, and that was an area that was particularly hard hit. It's also an area that was particularly hard hit by eviction. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. But because of eviction, it's distinctly changed the position of women in Ireland. So women had been an important part of the household economy for many, many reasons, one of which was domestic industry, right? So weaving, lace making, things like that. With widespread eviction, when people lost their homes, that put an end to women's domestic economy. We also see that a gender-neutral system of inheritance, where a father who held a leasehold would divide the land individually and equitably among his children. For his daughters, it usually became their dowry, but for their sons, it was the land that they would farm themselves. This gave way to male primogeniture. So these are very deep-seated changes that happen in Ireland in a very short period of time. So Theodore Hoppin, who's an Irish historian, he has maintained that many of the changes that other European countries went through over decades or even centuries, Ireland experienced in a few troubled years in the middle of the 19th century. And he says, in that time, Irish society experienced something akin to the Big Bang, okay, as if Ireland was made anew. So, what about the Irish famine? Why was it so devastating? Could a naturally occurring crop failure, blight, be considered genocide? So what do historians tell us? So although the reports of the damage to the potato crop reached London as early as August, actually it's kind of amazing, the first reports of a potato blight actually came from the Dublin Botanical Gardens. By the fall, the bad news had begun to spread throughout Ireland as a stench, which is the term used over and over again, creeped across the landscape. Within a day or two, the potato crop, which was already being harvested, would blacken in the ground and become inedible. It would become just a kind of watery mess. People scrambled to salvage as much of the plantings as they could as things went from edible to inedible. Oh, there you go. Here we go. Okay, so here we have, and there we have the Latin for the infestation itself, which we can all try to pronounce, Phytophora Infestands, and here we have a drawing of it. It shows you what the potato plant looks like. So the potato's in the ground, but not far deep in the ground. And you'll see that you know what, I once was in Yosemite, and the naturalist took us out at night to look at the stars, and she had a laser pointer that connected the constellations. So that's the one I want. So you can see blackness here, here, here. This is a drawing of the potato, and this is actually a picture of the potato. Not a picture from the famine. Really unfortunate, because the Irish famine happens right before photography comes in. And so really what we have in a kind of graphic or pictorial way of the famine is illustrations drawn mostly by visitors. So the devastation was complete. There was, you look at this and you think, well, could you possibly just cut away? Apparently that was not possible. And I actually had an experience of this several years ago. I think it was 2009, so that's more than a decade ago. In upstate New York, I was visiting family, and every night on the news, they would talk about the tomato blight. Now, I don't know if you know this, but like Easterners, people from the Northeast, they are very proud of their tomatoes. And if you don't like tomatoes, people from the Northeast will say, it's because you've never had a good one, okay? So, when they wait all year for tomato season, and it's not that long, but they are unlike any tomato ever grown in a hothouse. On the evening news, they would tell you every single night what areas had reported the tomato blight. And the tomato blight is the exact same blight that hit the potatoes and actually continues to hit the potatoes on a sporadic basis. Anyway, I remember being with my sister, and we were like, hey, let's go out and look at the tomatoes, see how they're doing. And we did. They looked great. They were fine. They weren't ripe yet. But we thought, oh, well, maybe we should, pick them just in case, fried green tomatoes. But, we're in upstate New York, so we wouldn't really know what to do with green tomatoes. Sure enough, the next morning, I went out, and the stems were sagging. There we go. That's tomato with the same infestation. The stems are sagging, the tomatoes have turned black, they're watery and completely inedible. So in 1845, this was not the first time there had been a blight or a crop failure of potatoes in Ireland. Even confirming, even if we confine our attention to the 19th century, there were numerous failures of the potato crop. In those cases, it was usually a fungus, and people had certain names for it: the curl, the dry rot, okay, the taint. In fact, it was common enough that the British government had a kind of emergency plan. They would import grain into Ireland. They would sell it at subsidized prices. They would begin a little public work scheme, and then the next year, everything would be great. It had happened 6 times in the 19th century alone. It had happened many times in the 18th century, but again, remember, it usually lasted only 1 season, and it didn't involve the entire Irish island. So actually in 1848, the British came up with a poor relief system which was supposed to tide the Irish over in case of these crop failures. This time, it was a different culprit, an unknown blight. Okay? And in fact, we constantly are doing research on this. We now have a sense that this is not a fungus at all. It's a mold, which is one of the reasons why it traveled through the air and through the water. It's also one of the reasons why the potato crop failed year after year after year, because the mold got deep into the soil. It actually came from America. Either the Andes, or there's new research that says Mexico. It actually hit the United States, the eastern part of the United States, in 1843. And it was in an American ship that it came to Ireland and Northern Europe in 1845. It spread to Germany, Switzerland, France, eventually to southern England, Scotland, and Ireland. This wet rot infected the potatoes, as I said, deeply into the ground. And the potato crop failed in Ireland in 1845, 1846, 1847, 1848, although the failure in 1848 was confined mostly to the northeast and the west of the island. In 1849, there was a better yield of potatoes, although by this point, mortality rates remained high because the population was so weakened and susceptible to various diseases. So if we look at the fact that this infestation in 1845 is a Northern European-wide infestation, why does Ireland starve? Ireland was more dependent on the potato than anywhere else in Europe, and this is one of the things that's often offered when people are talking about this question of, was the Irish famine a genocide, right? So it's a naturally occurring blight. And sometimes there's a sense in which there's some culpability on the part of the Irish because they were so dependent on the potato. There we go, okay. But in fact, their cultivation of the potato in many cases was making a virtue out of necessity. So in the 17th century, we see one of the greatest transfers of land from one group to another occurring in Ireland. So in the 17th century, we see the land being transferred, that's the nice word for it, confiscated, taken from the native Irish, and now given to English soldiers, adventurers, and bureaucrats in the 17th century. In this system, tenants were allowed to divide their land equally among their children, as I mentioned. Okay. And this is what you get. So you get all these small holdings, partible inheritance. If this were before the famine, When the leaseholder died, they would be dividing those lands even more. So after several generations, you're winding up with very small plots of land. So sometimes you have to go and find other plots of land that maybe are not as fertile. But the potato is truly a superfood. Okay? 1 acre of poor ground, not even the fertile midsection of Ireland, 1 acre of poor ground will yield 6 tons of potatoes in a year. In the early 1840s, the average adult laborer in Ireland consumed 14 pounds of potatoes a day. I had thought of bringing in a 10-pound bag of potatoes, but it would take me and my husband so long to eat them, I decided not to do it. I figured you could visualize what that would look like. At the same time, the average child in Ireland ate 11 pounds of potatoes a day. In normal times, they supplemented their diet with vegetables, with milk and milk products. I'm sure you all have a little bit of Kerrygold in your refrigerator. They added variety this way. They actually added nutrients to what was already the super rich, nutritious potato. They also had access to mountains for grazing. They had access to turf, which they cut and they burned for warmth and for cooking. If they were close to the coast, they could harvest seaweed and fish. Not so much fishing in the interior where the lakes were because the landlord owned the lake. But they often kept pigs. Pigs were for producing manure to enrich the soil and to pay your rent. It really did provide an integrated and effective system of production. And it is insanely easy to cultivate. You could do this at home. I could do this at home. And I only grow succulents. But these are what are called lazy beds. Okay? So the first one here on the left, this is in Aqua Island in County Mayo, which is an extreme western part of Ireland. It's actually one of the areas that was most hard hit by the famine. And what we see over here is a contemporary picture in West Cork, which is Professor Boaz's favorite area. These are abandoned lazy beds. They've been abandoned for decades. But one of the things that I hope you can see, first of all, reach for the stars pointer. Where am I? There we go. Okay, well, you can see the deep rivets, right? And all you had to do was walk along. It didn't even have to be straight. You took a stick, you made a hole in the ground, you threw some seed, which was just the eye of a potato, you covered it up, and since it rains all the time in Ireland, you never had to worry about actually watering it, right? This, as I said, although the Irish were very poor as peasants, they were renowned for being healthy and good-looking. None other than Adam Smith, he of Wealth of Nations and The Invisible Hand, actually complimented the health and handsomeness of the Irish he met in London and attributed their physical virtues. So he's meeting them in the late 17th century. He attributed their physical virtues to the potato, saying, "No food can afford a more decisive proof of nourishing quality or its being particularly suitable to the health of the human constitution." So for that argument that it's the Irish fault because they're too dependent on potatoes, it actually was a really good thing to eat potatoes in the mid-19th century. In fact, none other than Napoleon III tried desperately in the mid-19th century to get his peasantry to eat potatoes. He was not successful because they just fed them to the animals. But that was actually, there we go, that was actually an advantage because if you had any left over, if it was a bumper crop of potatoes, you could just feed them to the pig. So everybody loved potatoes. And the other thing is potatoes don't require a lot of cooking. I did grow up in an Irish household, and so we would eat the potatoes before my mother could cook them. And raw potatoes are actually very, very tasty. I'm not big on the cruciferous stuff, but anyway. So I wanted to point out, again, to drive home this idea that there is nothing wrong with the potato as your main source of nutrients. In fact, it's a really good idea if you have a population that experiences food scarcities. So this is actually from the Department of Agriculture, from the government of South Africa. And I've extracted a little piece here. The United Nations declared in 2008 the International Year of the Potato. I missed it. I was not aware. Potatoes are seen as a key component in the worldwide fight against hunger and malnutrition and the creation of food security. In any case, when the potato crop failed, it had devastating effect, but not because the Irish only grew potatoes. Remember, only 2/3 of the agriculture in Ireland was potato cultivation. Okay. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. Only 1/3 was potato cultivation. 2/3 was growing grains, vegetables, grazing. Irish cattle had been prized, actually, since the Middle Ages on English tables. Economic historians estimate that Ireland in the mid-19th century, at the time of the famine, could actually have fed a population of 16 million, twice its population of 8 million. It was actually already feeding 2 million more people than lived in Ireland, as it fed at least 2 million people in England who worked in the dark, satanic mills of industrial Britain. So why did the Irish starve when other parts of the British Isles affected by the Blight, such as southern England, the Channel Islands, and Scotland, did not? You are already familiar, because I read, what you were given to read, with John Mitchell's comment about the Almighty sent the Blight, but the English created the famine. The effort to explain how 1 million or 1.5 million people could starve to death within a 2 days' journey of London, the capital of the richest and most powerful empire on earth, has created a lot of heat among historians and not a lot of light. The Irish famine may be a historical event, certainly a demographic disaster, that changed the history of 3 continents, Europe, North America, and Australia. But it has always been a political flashpoint. And though we are now 150 years past it, it continues to overwhelm our understanding of it. The Irish themselves are surprisingly conflicted about the famine because the writing of Irish history is deeply political. Now, we live in such a political age now that you may think, well, whose national history is not really political? There was a time not so long ago when college students were actually taught about the consensus school of American history, right? And it is true, we have agreed as Americans on certain things, right? Like, we think the revolution was a good thing. Maybe it wasn't a great thing, maybe not even a good thing for everybody involved, but few of us, even the royal watchers and fans of Kate and William, are clamoring to bring back the monarchy, okay? So there are certain things that people, they kind of agree on. In Ireland, the writing of history is fraught with all kinds of dangers. How do you explain the famine without blaming the British government? The historical writing of the famine has often told us more about the people writing it and the time in which it was written than about the famine itself. Historians have to interpret the past, and it's naive to think of the writing of history as merely a recitation of what really happened. In 1945, at the centenary of the onset of the famine, the Irish Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, commissioned the writing of a commemorative volume by Ireland's leading historians. Just checking the time there. When the volume came out in 1953, and if you're doing a little math there, you're like, wait a minute. He commissioned it in 1945, and even though it takes historians a really long time to write things, that's a really long time, especially because, you know, it is kind of time sensitive, right? We're at the centenary. It would be nice if we could get it out there before the centenary passes. Well, there were some mistakes nobody could foresee, like part of the manuscript got left in the back of a taxi cab, and, you know, I mean, that may be funny to you, but think about what that means in an age before copier machines and computers and the cloud. Okay. The result, though, was a highly academic, intensely archival, largely institutional volume that completely avoided the question of culpability. Indeed, later Irish historians, as if to prove their seriousness, have simply avoided writing about the famine. The most important historian of the middle of the 20th century was a man named F.S.L. Lyons, Francis Stewart Leland Lyons. His magnum opus was a book called Ireland Since the Famine. Not even going to touch the famine. So either they've avoided writing about the famine, or they offer up a number of explanations that don't include criticism of the British government. From the 1970s, historians have mostly in Ireland been liberals. The novelist Colm Tóibín has pointed this out. And they wanted a non-sectarian, post-nationalist, pro-European Ireland. They felt that this enabled them to write history impartially. As a consequence, they attributed the devastation of the famine to an antiquated land system, to the inadequacy of any 19th century government to relieve a population as large and debilitated as the Irish in the 1840s. And they argued that there was as much food coming into Ireland as there was being exported to the industrial working classes of England. The truth is, from the end of World War II to the 1990s, Irish historians have ignored, marginalized, and sanitized this central experience in modern Irish history. And as if that's not enough, by their not working diligently on it as they would on any other question in Irish history, they have neglected to place it in a larger and more important context. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair has pointed out that the Irish famine is the defining event in the history of Ireland and Britain. So why? Why have they avoided it? Well, it's because writing Irish history in the last 75 years is always done with an eye on the British, one eye on the British, and one eye on the IRA. Ireland has had a long road to independence, and it has provided a model for independence for many parts of the British Empire, especially India and Egypt. Yet, unlike the empire, Ireland's proximity to Britain continued to tie the country to Britain. I mean, even something as silly as money, right? Although, obviously, that doesn't become too silly. That's one of the reasons the Brits wanted to leave the European Union and wouldn't change to the euro. But when Ireland became independent and it needed a new system of money, it instituted the Irish punt, which is simply the Irish word for pound, as in pound sterling. And its value was completely tied to the pound sterling. It wasn't until they became part of the European monetary system that they were able to break out of this. However, with the Celtic Tiger, the great economic boom when the Irish economy in the 1990s was growing at 10% a year, and the Anglo-Irish Peace Accords, also known as the Good Friday Accords, in 1998 and the laying down of the IRA's arms, Irish historians seemed free to discuss British capability without fear, British culpability without fear that they were, in fact, supporting sectarian violence. The last 20 years has been really a great era for the writing of Irish history about the famine. So let's turn to the question of genocide. This has been a question that obviously traces back to the famine itself, and extermination is the word that is often used, since Lemkin doesn't coin the term genocide until 1944. Extermination is inherent in John Mitchell's statement about God, the British, and the famine, and it's explicit in Raphael Lemkin's invocation of Ireland in his condemnation of the Ukrainian famine. Does it meet the UN criteria? So you read an article by Timothy Guinane that says it doesn't. One of your readings says it does. And the third reading kind of sort of fudged a little bit. No one disputes the horror of the famine. Frederick Douglass, the former slave and abolitionist, was traveling in Ireland at the start of the famine. And he said that the condition of the Irish peasants he saw was, in his opinion, that of white Negroes. An English soldier who was stationed in Ireland during the famine wrote to his mother, describing coming across a woman lying dead in the road with a child still at her breast, although the child itself was already dead as well. The child having completely bitten off the nipple for nourishment. The Illustrated London News, which was a paper that sometimes was sympathetic to the Irish, commented that the general condition of Ireland in 1847 was that the Irish cotter, that is, person who lives in a cottage, just works a little bit of land, is as much a serf as the Russian peasant, except that he is worse fed. Travelers wrote of seeing masses of people on the roads who held up their dead children as coaches passed by, begging those inside to bury the children. The ships that carried immigrants to Canada were known as coffin ships because they often had higher mortality rates than those suffered by Africans in the Middle Passage. Initially, the government under, the government under Sir Robert Peel reacted quickly, setting up public work schemes. He even imported some grain from the United States, but he had to kind of keep that quiet because people in Britain might get upset, so he did it secretly. Indeed, the first year of the famine, with his policy of works, relief works, and corn importation, meant that Ireland did not starve. And I want to go back to this picture for a moment, if I can. There we go. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can see this. Do you see anything behind this woman and her children? No, is it hard? Okay, there's an arm. He's squatting. Here's a leg. This is from a series called The Spectre. And this one was done in 1846. It actually was done, there were a number of these drawings, and they were done to raise money in England for the suffering of the Irish. As terrible as it is, I mean, here we have this tiny little child who's burying its head in its hands in grief. This child is dead. We don't know what the condition over here, and here is the mother. We are to actually say that the Irish are okay. It's just that the specter of death hangs over them. Unfortunately, the fact that the Irish didn't starve in 1845-46 was interpreted by many that the British government had been too generous. And although they, as I said, Peel did a number of good things, He also had a very anti-Irish attitude that was based on his time in Ireland 30 years earlier when he was Chief Secretary for Ireland. He said, and I have the quotation up there, "The Irish need firm lessons because they cannot understand oblique ones." When his government fell in 1846, he was replaced with the Whig Prime Minister, Lord John Russell. But the real architect of Britain's policy in Ireland was this man. I know you're waiting. There we go. Sir Charles Trevelyan. He was actually a civil servant, which meant when one government went out of power, he stayed on. Private philanthropy actually did much more than the British government did in the first year or two of the famine, especially the Quakers. The Quakers are the great heroes of the Irish famine. They relieved the Irish open-heartedly without any regard to religion, and they often paid for their kindnesses with their lives as they contracted the same diseases that the suffering Irish had contracted. They also were able to contact Quaker networks in the overseas, in the US and in England. In many ways, large and small, the world quickly responded with great generosity to the suffering of the Irish. Some of you may know that the Choctaw and the Cherokee contributed. They sent several $100s to the relief of the poor Irish, as they said. And they recognized a special kinship with the Irish, who were also made to walk miles as they were evicted from their homes by their landlords in their own Trail of Tears. A school for young ladies in New York on 9th Street held a fair, collected $287, and they sent it for the suffering Irish, although they did stipulate that $50 had to go to, quote, the Scotch. A member of the New York State Senate, who was the head of the New York Committee of Relief, estimated that Irish domestics, that is, the Irish who worked as servants in rich people's homes, contributed $1 million to Irish famine relief. The New York Stock Exchange, I'm sure Mayor Bloomberg would be happy to hear this, actually contributed $2,000. Some wealthy people in Washington, D.C., such as Thomas Corcoran, contributed $5,000. The situation in Britain was different because there was always the notion of protocol. For those contributing to the Irish through the British Relief Fund, Queen Victoria's contribution of £2,000 became the ceiling for donations. And if any of you have been fans of Victoria, the series, I have to admit I watched the whole thing, that episode on the famine, I can't remember the actress who plays Victoria, but she's just so appealing. I'll move on. When the Sultan of Turkey wanted to contribute £5,000, he was told to reduce it to 1,000 because you can't outdo the Queen. It should probably be pointed out, though, before you think that the Sultan of Turkey was being generous from an open heart, there probably was a quid pro quo involved in that. He was trying to get the English to join him in an alliance at that time. The Pope issued an encyclical in March of 1847 ordering that the prayers be said throughout the Catholic world for the Irish, and money was collected for the relief of Ireland. Money poured in from Sydney, Australia, from Grahamstown, South Africa, and from Argentina, all over the Catholic world. The Pope even offered an indulgence of 7 years, remission of punishment for sins, if you prayed for 3 days for the Irish poor. He personally contributed 1,000 Roman crowns from his personal finances. The bishops of Ireland raised £400,000. When it had become obvious that the potato crop in the summer of 1846 was failing, the government instituted a roads work project, which mostly meant breaking up rocks. The point was that the starving could earn money and therefore eat, and it would keep their virtue and their morality intact. That the English would not be creating a dependent people, especially given the fact that in the English estimation, the Irish were notoriously lazy. In September of 1846, there were 26,000 men employed on the relief works. By March of 1847, there were 714,000. The money they earned did not prevent those who were working from dying, however. The chairman of the Board of Works wrote, "Their bodily strength gone and their spirits depressed, they have not the power to exert themselves sufficiently to earn an ordinary day's wage." The other thing is the winter of 1846-47 was exceptionally cold in Ireland. And Irish peasants actually didn't own warm clothes. I don't know if you've ever been in Ireland in November, December, January, February. It rains all the time. Basically Ireland acts as an umbrella for the rest of the Isles. And since they couldn't work in the fields because everything was so muddy, they didn't really go out very much. They didn't go out for extended periods of time, but with the relief works, they were expected to be out there working all day. Instead of keeping them alive, the winter work killed them. The government decided to end the public works in January of 1847. They were going to instead open up soup kitchens because the Quaker soup had been so successful, but it actually took them a really long time. And between March of 1847 and June or July of 1847, there was literally nothing available from the government. The relief works had stopped, and the soup kitchens had not started. And this was just one of the reasons why 1847 was known as Black 47, the worst year of the famine. And it's actually a pretty good movie. I actually watched it recently. So in the summer of 1847, the British government stopped its famine relief aid, and probably more importantly, it forbid any more private aid, okay? So the schoolboys in Manhattan who had contributed $1.54 in pennies, or Thomas Corcoran who had contributed $5,000, or the Quakers who month after month after month raised money and did the hard work in Ireland, they were told no more. You can't do that. Historians have pointed out that had support of the British population, particularly the middle classes, who now seem to be suffering from donor fatigue, contributed, certainly they would have been able to mitigate the disaster of Black 47. The Irish historian James Donnelly said, if Britons were well along towards spending £10 million to relieve the Irish starvation by the spring of 1847, without being able to see any permanent signs of improvement, the question arose whether the problem was financial or, as seemed more likely, moral and racial and cultural. Britons, and particularly the English public, came to feel that it was not wise or necessary to continue to relieve the Irish. Though not deficient in resources, the Irish displayed, they said, a crafty, a calculating, a covetous idleness. In the face of this, really, I mean, what could the British do? The Irish were just so lazy. The London News posed the question, if the splendor of our benevolence has not kept pace with the hideousness of her misery, it has not been from any want of inclination on the part of the living race of Englishmen. I mean, the racial distinctions there are very rich. In attempts to manage the famine, the government, led by Trevelyan, who you saw a few minutes ago, but I have to point out, supported by many others, shifted the burden onto the Irish, in particular to the Irish landlord. The British government made the workhouse the center of their efforts to relieve the famine. The workhouse, however, was paid for by Irish landlords. An Irish poor law had come into effect in 1838 because of all of those earlier blights. And the deprivation of the winter of 1846-47 significantly swelled the numbers of people seeking relief in the workhouse. You can tell that they must have been utterly desperate, because once families went into the workhouse, they were separated according to gender and age, and they had to give up any of the lands that they had before they went into the workhouse. Here you see one of the many, this is a very typical plan of the workhouse. And over here you see an illustration, this was in the Illustrated London News, of hordes of people trying to get into the workhouse. If you could see it up close, you would see how debilitated, how walking corpses they seem to appear. The workhouses were vastly crowded, which is why nobody's being let in, and this made them the center of death and disease. In Skibbereen, I understand a number of you spent some time talking about Skibbereen. I don't know if you heard about the little song that was put together, right? Arise, ye ghosts of Skibbereen, and come to Cork to see our queen. That was to greet Queen Victoria when she arrived to see of the suffering of her Irish subjects. Anyway, in Skibbereen, a market town in West Cork, that would become a cry of revenge in the late 19th and early 20th century. The workhouse was built to house 800 people. In January of 1847, so that's the start of Black 47, it housed 1,169. By mid-March, the number had gone up to 1,450 people. So, what I'm showing you here is you have the blueprints over there of the workhouse in Skibbereen. My laser pointer won't go as far, so I can't point out to you that it is very much segregated by age and sex. So there's a section for aged women, a section for aged men, for boys, for girls. There's a schoolroom for boys, a schoolroom for girls. There are yards for boys, yards for girls. And if you look at this picture here on the left, this is actually taken at the Famine Museum in Skibbereen, which I really recommend if you ever go to Ireland. Come with us. If you ever go to Ireland, go to the Famine Museum there. As a historian, I got to hit every one, right? I have to hit every marker on the California highways to see what the historic marking is. I have to go to every famine museum, and there's a National Famine Museum in Strokestown, which is not nearly as good as this really tiny place in Skibbereen. What you see there, actually, it's kind of a weird angle, is a student. There's a student sitting, and she's sitting on a square that measures 2 by 2. That was actually the amount of space apportioned to inmates of the workhouse in 1847 when it became so crowded. So, in fact, this is a mock-up of what the girls' schoolroom looked like, and each person got 2 square feet. And as you can see, just enough to sit cross-legged. Despite the sufferings in the workhouses and the increased numbers coming into the workhouses, the government resisted any attempt to relieve people outside of the workhouse. Right? They had stopped outdoor relief, they had stopped private efforts. Given what they believed about the natural laziness of the Irish, many agreed with Thomas Batson, who was a conservative member of Parliament for County Londonderry, when he warned, if the right to outdoor relief were established by law, the whole of Ireland would be one monster poorhouse, and the Prime Minister of England would be the head relieving officer. The Irish Poor Law was funded by Irish landowners on the basis of each person who went into the workhouse cost the landlord money. This encouraged landlords to, many of them actually, by the way, didn't even live in Ireland, they lived in England, knew very little about their tenants, and many of them attempted to get the tenants off their land rather than have to pay the poor rates. In June of 1847, again, in the middle of Black 47, thinking that things couldn't get any worse, Parliament passed what was called the Gregory Clause. And this meant that anybody who owned even a tiny bit of land, I mean, least a tiny bit of land, even a quarter acre, could not get in to the workhouse unless they gave up their land. The famine was removing from the land now not just those who had subsisted on the potato, but small farmers who before the Blight had actually been able to successfully farm. Many in the Whig Party, which was the party in power, claimed that this was necessary if any good was going to come of the famine. Notice that phrase, any good going to come of this famine. The rates of eviction soared as a result of the Gregory Clause, throwing already starving Irish out onto the roads where they died in startling numbers. A popular explanation for the vast misery of the Irish in the years 1845 to 1851 is that they were victims of political economy. They died of an idea. This theory drew on Adam Smith. You remember him, he's the guy who thought that the Irish were so good looking. It drew on his notion of an invisible hand that kept a balance between supply and demand. Smith argued that when an individual pursued self-interest, he directly assisted society because he created competition. Governments, according to Smith, should stay out of the marketplace. Free trade, in the famous term of the time, laissez-faire, was the rule. In the 19th century, what we see is that Adam Smith's ideas on political economy are married to the teachings of Thomas Malthus, who pointed out that while resources increase arithmetically, think just add 1 and 1 and 1, population increases exponentially. For Malthus, this means that population will always outstrip food supply, causing overpopulation, which will inevitably lead to famine. For Malthus, natural and artificial factors keep a population in check, and it means that when a population outstrips the food supply, either another source of food has to be found, or the population will have to be decreased through starvation. In terms of crop failure, which, by the way, other Englishmen said was God's favorite way of reducing population, the situation would be even worse because the imbalance between food and population would shift suddenly. So what did this mean for the Irish? It meant that the English saw danger and possibility for the British state, while the suffering Irish were real, and the government agreed that their suffering was real. The government had to be careful. To simply relieve the Irish as the other nations facing Blight at this time did, threatened to make the situation worse. Leaders in the government would say, well, then, of course the Belgians can relieve their population because they're Belgian, they're not Irish. Of course we can relieve the Scots because they're Scots, they're not Irish, which means by nature, barbarous, lazy, all things not English. For many in the government, especially Charles Trevelyan, George Wood, and George Grey, the danger that in relieving the Irish, the government or private philanthropists might make them even more lazy, more duplicitous, was a serious concern. The eviction and removal of Irish tenants from the land, even those who could claim the status of small farmers, presented an opportunity, something good to get out of this famine. Irish landlords, many of whom, remember, were actually resident in England, many English politicians, including the future Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, owned significant amounts of Irish land and had many Irish tenants. They could modernize those farms and escape the poor rates at the same time. This was not the first time the English government tried to remove the Irish from Ireland. They had actually tried it in the 17th century in somewhat less draconian ways. I guess I'm trying to leave us a little bit of time for discussion here. So I do want to mention that there were dissenting voices within the British government. The Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, was not the avid anti-Irish fanatic that Charles Trevelyan was, or Lord Lansdowne, or even Palmerston. There were some who were very concerned about the government's policies. Trevelyan himself believed that one of the authorities that he had to answer to, besides the British taxpayer, was God. And that clearly God had called a famine on the Irish to punish them, and for the English to interfere with God's judgment, to punish what he called an indolent and unself-reliant people, would just cause punishment for the English. Sir William Nassau, a member of Parliament, remarked that the death of 2 million people in Ireland in this famine might not be enough to solve the problem. Trevelyan was anxious not to interfere with Providence. He was worried about turning this blessing into a curse. In his own words, God grant that we may rightly perform our part and not turn into a curse what was intended as a blessing. In an attempting to assess the extent of the Irish who died of a marriage between political economy and theology, it's important to remember, as I said, that not all English politicians felt this way. Many saw the government's actions as harsh and indeed a failure of government and morality. The chief poor law officer in Ireland tangled with Secretary Trevelyan repeatedly. His name was Thistleton. I always think the heroes deserve to be mentioned as much as the villains here. And he tangled with Trevelyan over the stinginess of the government in its policy towards Ireland. Through the beginning of 1849, Twistleton begged the government for additional funding as mortality rates increased. When Trevelyan pushed yet another tax on Irish landlords to pay for expanded poorhouse relief, Twistleton resigned, and he made public statements after that criticizing the government. He believed, he said, that in providing relief to Ireland, all that would be required was a comparatively trifling sum. On the other hand, he said, it would spare Britain the deep disgrace of permitting any of our miserable fellow subjects in this distressed union to die of starvation. I wish to leave distinctly on record that from want of sufficient food, many persons in these workhouses are at present dying and wasting away. And at the same time, it is quite possible for this country to prevent the occurrence here of any deaths from starvation, by the advance of a few hundred pounds. In supporting Thistleton, the Earl of Clarendon, who was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the chief government officer in Ireland, and a member of the Prime Minister's cabinet, wrote to Prime Minister Russell explaining why Twistleton resigned. He said he thinks that the destitution here in Ireland is so horrible and the indifference of the House of Commons is so manifest that he is an unfit agent of a policy that must be one of extermination. Actually, Clarendon himself had already urged the Prime Minister to ask the House of Commons to come through with some more funding, and he said, "I don't think there is another legislature in Europe that would regard such suffering as now exists in the west of Ireland or coldly persist in a policy of extermination." Okay, so I actually have succeeded in getting, as you can see, I missed a lot, but getting to our discussion about genocide, the UN's definition, and how the Irish famine fits into that. So you have little handouts in front of you, which pretty much says the same thing here. So how do we evaluate the Irish famine in terms of these definitions of genocide? Anybody have any ideas? So as we go through here, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm. It talks about an intent to destroy in whole or in part. It talks about deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births, forcibly transferring children. Do you see any of these that you think might apply? Anyone brave enough? Okay, well, I'll just give you my thoughts on this. And I will tell you, just by the way, as a historian now with a 30-year career behind her, I've been on both sides of this issue. Okay, so I don't actually, I have qualms on both sides. But it seems to me that we can say yes to number 2 and 3, right? Causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life, calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. It strikes me, and this is something that Timothy Gwynane brought up in your readings, it strikes me it goes to the issue of intent. And that's the hard part, right? That's right. Did the government intend? We are used to modern models, right, where we have meetings of people who talk about extermination as a policy. Gwynane says the British government's indifference to the famine helped cause thousands of needless deaths. That actually sounds kind of on the low side to me, I don't know. But it was indifference nonetheless, not an active effort at systematic murder. So maybe we'll have a minute or two right at the end. I just want to finish with, I mentioned that 50% of the Irish speakers in Ireland were gone by 1851. 25 years after the famine, the Irish speaker Marie na Grania, who lived in the Rosses, Donegal, quite near actually where the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar made his statements about Priti Patel's comments, Marie na Grania summed up the impact of the famine. She wrote, "The years of the famine," and of course she wrote this in Irish, but I only know Dríis Mitkehi Weltu. That's it, the sum total, so I will read it in English for you. "The years of the famine, of the bad life, and of the hunger arrived and broke the spirit and strength of the community. People simply wanted to survive. The spirit of comradeship was lost. It didn't matter what ties or relations you had. You considered that person to be your friend who gave you food to put in your mouth. Recreation and leisure ceased. Poetry, music, and dancing died. These things were lost and completely forgotten. When life improved in other ways, these pursuits never returned as they had been. The famine killed everything. Those are my remarks. So I would be interested in your questions.